This is Minds Blown.
We aren't looking for just anybody to join the Space Force.
We're calling on all late-night coders, early morning gamers, self-proclaimed space geeks, stargazing science junkies, tireless trailblazers, daydreamers, and especially square peg in a round hole type thinkers. To shape the force that protects our interest in space and our everyday lives on Earth, the only force created for the 21st century.
We need people like you.
So consider this your invitation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first bonus series of Minds Blown called Make It Plain. We are your hosts, Vincent and Tandy, and
Olamide Samuel.
so like our regular podcast, our goal is to show how the issue of nuclear weapons affects people in their everyday lives. Our goal has always been to take this conversation out of the stuffy academic think tank world and bring it more to the mainstream. But we realize that this issue in particular, nuclear weapons, is a bit harder to understand. For many people who are not experts, it can be very abstract, it can be very technical. You can feel that you need a PhD in physics to really be in the conversation. And in fact, it can be pretty boring. So, with these bonus episodes, we want to take a current event happening in the news that you may have read about. And we want to explain it to you in a way that is easily digestible, makes it clear, makes it plain, and also talk about why you should care. Hence, we want to make it plain. So to start, Ola, we have heard in the last couple weeks about Russia putting nuclear weapons in space.
Russian nukes in space. Multiple sources are telling CNN tonight that the U.S. has new intelligence on Russia's efforts to deploy a nuclear anti-satellite system in space.
And from what I'm seeing on social media and talking to folks, I think there are really two camps when hearing a story like this. And one is that there are those that say, WTF, we're now going to have nuclear weapons in space. We're going to die. What is actually happening? Should I hide under my desk or go in my basement? The other camp seems to be like, meh, who cares? I don't really understand it. It's beyond me. It's all going to work out. If it does happen, there's nothing I can really do to stop it. And actually, we're starting to see some within the kind of a policy world saying, calm down. They really haven't done anything yet. We have treaties, really nothing to worry about. So just take a step back. I'm going to turn it over to you and talk about where the story came from. And quite frankly, Ola, what the heck is going on with Russia putting nuclear weapons in space?
Absolutely. So, in February 2024, the US stated that it believed Russia was developing a space-based anti-satellite nuclear weapon, whose detonation could disrupt everything from military communications to phone-based ride services like Uber. Now, Biden administration officials have publicly emphasized that this weapon is still under development and it is not yet in orbit. But if this weapon were to be used, officials say that it will cross a dangerous line in the history of nuclear weapons and it could cause extreme disruptions to everyday life in ways that are difficult to predict.
Okay, let's stop right there. So already you have said that there is a nuclear weapon that can actually go into space.
Yeah.
So we're putting these on what types of missiles? How are we doing this? And then we'll talk later about treaties and things like that. But you mentioned that it could actually disrupt things as far as phones and things like that. First, let's talk about how this actually would work. And then we'll talk about why this seems like a problem for the whole world here.
Absolutely. I mean, this new kind of weapon, it is usually known by military space experts as a nuclear EMP, that is, a nuclear electromagnetic pulse. And this pulse could create a wave of electromagnetic energy and a flood of highly charged particles that would actually tear through space and disrupt other satellites that are orbiting around the Earth. Now, as you know, we have satellites in space and in Earth's orbit that help us with things like GPS positioning, helps us with things like radio communications, satellite TV. That's where the satellite and satellite TV comes from. So having a weapon, a nuclear detonation in space that would create an EMP, it would essentially disrupt all of these satellites or a majority of these satellites. And, this is something that would cripple much of our modern way of living today. Those of you that don't have physical maps at home, that usually rely on Google Maps to get from point A to point B, if an EMP were used, GPS is gone. Like, you're not going to be able to find where you're going.
This sounds very, first of all, sci-fi. I mean, we literally have movies called Star Wars. This
Yep.
sounds quite crazy, also scary. But when you say it could mess up satellite things or GPS and our cell phones and TVs and things like that, why would Russia want to put a nuclear weapon in space so that I can't watch my Arsenal football club, win the Premier League? Why do they care about these? Is that their goal, just to make our lives a living hell, or is there something more to it?
I wouldn't say that Russia is hell bent on making everyone's lives miserable, but I would say that Russia has this strategy of always manipulating risk, practically threatening to do crazy things and going halfway there just to ensure that the US or their adversaries back down from perhaps taking a particular action or seizing an action that they're currently undertaken. So within the wider context of like the war between Russia and Ukraine, for example, one could explain this risk escalation by Russia as a way of increasing the costs of increased US support for Ukraine or increased US involvement in this conflict. So there's many reasons that Russia would want to, grandstand in this way. And frankly speaking, civilians like you and me and people just wanting to go about their day-to-day lives are seen as collateral damage, if we're being frank. War always has a way of disrupting our day-to-day lives.
Russia, let's say if they move forward with this. Now, we should say that Putin, when he got called out on this, recently said, no, he has no intentions of doing this. But I mean, who can believe anything Putin says? Let's say they go ahead and they actually try to do this. I remember growing up in the 80s
Mm.
that you had this whole issue of Star Wars, they called it, which was with Ronald Reagan. President Reagan wanted to have this strategic defense initiative.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
And I remember at one point, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, the visionary who really ended the Cold War, met with President Reagan and was prepared to completely eliminate nuclear weapons. And he had asked Reagan that he just shelf all of the testing and the work on this Star Wars, keep it in the laboratory for 10 years. Essentially, don't weaponize space, so we could eliminate nuclear weapons right now. And Reagan says no, famously, and we lose, that golden hour. We lose that opportunity. But the plans that Reagan had, everybody said were pretty fanciful and really outlandish, and it actually never came to fruition. So could Russia actually pull this off, or is this just a threat that nobody really needs to worry about?
Pre the invasion of Ukraine, I would say Russia's threatening was perhaps if there was a 50-50 chance and we shouldn't really worry. So you very helpfully pointed out the Star Wars initiative by President Reagan in the 1980s, and I think it will be very helpful for our listeners to know what we're talking about. So the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI, was first announced by US President Ronald Reagan in a nationwide television address in March of 1983. Now, because parts of the system, the defensive system, that Reagan advocated would be based in space, the proposed system was dubbed, quote, Star Wars.
Now witness the firepower of this fully armed and operational battle station.
The movie Star Wars, which featured advanced space weaponry.
Right.
SDI was intended to defend the US from attacks from Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, or
Stop.
ICBMs.
All right, stop right there for listeners who have no idea what you just said, and let's explain that before we go any further.
Oh, yes. So, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, are basically missiles that have, first of all, an intercontinental range, and they're also missiles that fly on ballistic trajectories. So, let's break down ballistic trajectories in a simplistic way. It's 4th of July in the US, or it's New Year's in, other parts of the world. And you have your fireworks that you let off. Now, fireworks actually fly on a ballistic trajectory in the sense that it's a tiny rocket that explodes and shoots up into the sky. And, when it gets to the peak of its ascent, gravity starts pulling it down. Usually fireworks go off in the air, so, it goes like choo, upwards and just explodes. Whereas for a missile, they're expected to complete that ballistic trajectory, upward motion, stalling in the air, and then coming down with the force of gravity and the force of the rocket itself. So an ICBM is essentially a much bigger kind of firework, usually with a nuclear warhead attached that has an intercontinental range. And so when it's launched, it goes up, some of them going into space, they complete the initial stages of their flight, and they start descending back into Earth with the force of gravity. Star Wars, or the SDI, was basically a system to intercept these ICBMs at various stages of their flight. So to intercept ICBMs probably at their ascent or their descent or terminal phases of flight. Think of ascent just as going up, descent as coming back into Earth's atmosphere, and terminal phases, the rocket going towards its final target. And so SDI was meant to intercept rockets at different stages. But for this interception, given how fast ICBMs move, many of them, thousands of kilometers per hour, SDI would require extremely advanced technological systems that, at least in the 1980s, were yet to be researched or developed.
I know this is a formidable technical task, one that may not be accomplished before the end of this century. I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
Now, among the potential components of this SDI system were both space and Earth-based laser battle stations, which by a combination of methods would direct their laser beams towards moving Soviet ICBM.
Earth-based nuclear-powered X-ray lasers fire their radioactive rays. Attack rays from land-based excimer lasers are redirected by huge mirrors orbiting in space. Chemical lasers fire beams that burn through the shell of the onrushing missile.
In addition, we had some air-based missile platforms and some ground-based missiles that will provide the last lines of defense and will be concentrated around major targets in the US, such as the US's own ICBM silos or key points of government. So, when you watch a lot of movies, you find that many movie directors expect the White House to be protected from all sorts of incoming missiles. So the last line of defense, was also something that the SDI took into account. SDI also involved creating sensors that could actually detect Soviet attacks, when they launched them. The sensors would basically detect Soviet attacks, and these sensors could be based on the ground, in the air, in space, and these sensors use different technologies like radar, optical, or even infrared threat detection systems. Now, SDI was really expensive. I'm talking about massive amounts of government funding that, we can get into if we want. But this initial funding for Star Wars had been approved by the US Congress by the mid-1980s. But the program caused heated debate among both arms control experts and public officials over its military and its political implications. Now, the supporters of Star Wars claimed that the technical obstacles to implementing the system could be overcome in the 1980s, and that an effective defensive system would deter potential Soviet attacks. On the other hand, critics of Star Wars argued that the scheme was not technically possible. They also argued that it would encourage a further arms race, and critically, that it would undermine established arms control agreements and even weaken the prospects for future arms control agreements. Now, testing continued on a number of Star Wars-related devices, but when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of the US's defense requirements changed accordingly.
Okay, let's stop there. Let's kind of recap here for those of us that are complete novices. So at first in the 1980s, we got President Reagan coming up with this Star Wars SDI plan with lasers and having, it's a shield. It's going to protect us. But no matter what he was talking about, it never came to fruition. It was too expensive. The technology wasn't there. And it actually cost us, it seems like, universal disarmament in some ways, or could have been. Okay. Now, fast forward, we don't hear much about this now. And now we get to a couple weeks ago where now Vladimir Putin is saying he wants to put nuclear weapons in space.
Mhm.
So if he puts nuclear weapons in space, so if he tries to do this now, couple questions. One, the problem would be, if I get this correct from what you're saying, is if he explodes the nuclear weapon,
Mhm.
okay, if the nuclear weapon detonates, then you have satellite disruption,
Mhm.
people's everyday lives, the internet, phones, GPS, all of that is now a mess because of what he does. And I know this might sound, I may know the answer to this, but as far as radiation goes and particles and everything that comes out of a nuclear weapon, being so far away in space, would there be any residual effects of that at all, or would that just all kind of disintegrate into space and that would be the end of it? I'm thinking of the space station. I'm thinking of, all of
Mm.
these kind of things. So is that anything that that people would have to worry about? How does that work?
Oh, Putin detonating a nuclear weapon in space is not going to have the same radiological impact as a nuclear weapon detonated on the ground. Radiation would almost immediately dissipate in space because there's no air to carry out or to carry radioactive particles around. So that's not the primary concern. But a big concern, of course, would be charging the dispersal of charged particles that could affect everybody in the International Space Station, that could affect all these different satellites. And so, even though it's not going to have a direct impact on human beings on Earth, all of these space based systems that we rely on could be potentially disrupted. And I think that's the real danger of having a nuclear weapon in space. And this is a danger that, frankly speaking, many states as far back as the 1960s understood, and they weren't willing to tolerate the danger of putting a nuclear weapon in space. And this is why they developed the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which should
Okay.
bar states from doing this.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up because that was going to be my next point. For all of us that are worried now about what's happening and trying to wrap our heads around now having nuclear weapons in space. So when I read this, immediately thought of one, what you just mentioned, what was the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And in fact, when I tweeted about what Russia was doing, a lot of people said, no reason to get upset. We have this treaty in place. This treaty says, that it bars Russia from placing weapons of mass destruction in outer space.
Mm.
It prohibits military activities in space, etc. And then I also thought, of course, of President Kennedy and the partial nuclear test ban treaty, which he pushed for and ultimately got done, which again said that we should ban atmospheric testing and space nuclear weapons. So if we have these treaties already in place, why am I worried? Seems like these are in place for a reason, and it would bar Russia from actually pulling something like this off.
Honestly, if international treaties, were foolproof and bulletproof, we shouldn't worry at all. We have the Outer Space Treaty that bars states from putting nuclear weapons in space. We have so many different nuclear weapons free zone treaties, which covers much of the global south, that bars states from transporting their nuclear weapons even through these nuclear weapons free zones. We have the Non Proliferation Treaty of 1968 that has preambular language, which is basically language that carries the spirit of the treaty, where Russia, along with the other nuclear weapon states that signed onto the NPT, acknowledge the devastating impact of using nuclear weapons and, in good faith, have taken on an obligation to disarm. Now, if all of these treaties worked perfectly, we wouldn't have any problem. However, we have seen in recent times Russia turning treaties on their head. Signing on to the New START Treaty, for example, which limits strategic offensive weapons between the US and Russia, suspending this treaty, and now we're scared that Russia might actually start breaching the limits set by this treaty. We had Russia walking away from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. We've had them essentially taking an axe to international law. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we're seeing that the US and its allies are also willing to look the other way when certain international law is being broken. So, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, for example, is one instance where even the West and their allies that talk about adherence to international law are willing, when the conditions are right, to ignore international law. So, our fear is that Russia might do the same thing to the Outer Space Treaty as it has with other treaties, and would be willing to breach the Outer Space Treaty because the respect for international law is gradually and gradually eroding. So that's the real problem here. That states are not respecting the agreements they are obliged to, and that states are also willing to use their breaking of these treaties or potential breaking of these treaties as leverage to compel and to coerce their adversaries.
Well, one thing, so now it seems like we have treaties that are actually in place to stop this. That seems like people in the 1960s, including President Kennedy, maybe foresaw something like this happening and tried to prevent this from happening. But if reading the Outer Space Treaty, for those of you that are not familiar, it would bar a country from placing weapons of mass destruction in outer space. However, that language got me where it says it bars a country from placing weapons of mass destruction in space. It doesn't say anything about launching them into space. Is that semantics, or am I right there in that there is kind of a loophole there where you can launch it into space? No, but you can't house it there. Is that, am I correct there, or am I off?
No, you're definitely correct. And this is another problem with international law that frustrates me. Is if there is a loophole to be exploited, even in just ambiguous language of a treaty, that loophole will be exploited. Now, the Outer Space Treaty bars states from placing weapons in space. But what does placing mean?
Exactly.
Permanently, temporarily, in transit, And this has actually been something that has been exploited by almost every nuclear weapon state. Nuclear weapon states have ICBMs, as I told you before. These little, well, not so little fireworks with nuclear tips that fly in a ballistic trajectory. Most ICBMs must at some point fly through Earth's orbit, even temporarily. And these ICBMs don't seem to be illegal under the Outer Space Treaty because they're in transit through space. So, Russia testing this particular weapon is something that would refocus attention on the semantics of the Outer Space Treaty. But they're not the most recent, or they are the most recent ones to test this, but not so long ago. In 2021, China also tried to push the limits of the Outer Space Treaty by testing a fractional orbital bombardment system, or FOBS, which was another kind of ICBM that utilized space for a very short period of time in its own trajectory, which was not ballistic, but we wouldn't get into those semantics. But the point here is that states are utilizing portions of space for their nuclear weapons, and they are somehow willing to push the boundaries of the loopholes that have been accepted so far.
One thing that also kind of keeps coming up for me when looking at this is when we look at whether it's historically been the US or Russia or China, is the issue of empire, right? And the idea that can you, through your military, through your weapon systems, if you can't control land, air, space, and sea. And so is this yet okay? We dominate, a country dominates through their naval systems and through the sea, and they have certain land, and now we're going to try to conquer, dominate, have an empire in space as well. Is that an underlying piece here, or am I just getting too grand in what I'm thinking, the motives are of some of these countries, including the US?
Honestly, you're not getting too grand. I must say that, land, air, space, the seas, these are technically domains, at least from the point of view of the great powers. once there is a domain, they are going to try to dominate this domain. I mean, think of cyber, right? You know,
Mm.
internet and the connection of computer systems and all of that. I mean, it's not been too recent since great powers considered cyber to be a domain that they could dominate as well. And so, even beyond our physical domains, including space, great powers want to dominate every identifiable domain where there could potentially be a risk of conflict or challenges between and amongst them.
Our nation's internet, including Twitter, runs through our vulnerable space satellites. POTUS wants complete space dominance, boots on the moon by 2024. To that end, the president is creating a new branch, Space Force, which Mark will run.
What?
In close cooperation with Air Force, which Kik will still head.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
This is not a joke. His words, boots on the moon in 2024. Actually, he said boobs on the moon, but we believe that to be a typo.
So, Russia pushing the envelope with regards to the Outer Space Treaty is in line with this expansionist thinking. Russia pushing the envelope with regards to Ukraine's borders is in line with this expansionist thinking. The colonial British Empire pushing the borders with regards to domination of the high seas is in line with this expansionist thinking. China pushing the borders of Taiwan is in line with this expansionist thinking. So we are living in a world where a few states believe it's their God-given right to control the affairs of all other man or all other humans, regardless of what countries they come from. So when India launched anti-satellite tests, the whole world got into a frenzy about it. Iran launched a couple of ballistic missiles, not nuclear, and the E3, the UK, France, and Germany were quick to put out a statement saying, hey, Iran, don't, utilize ballistic missiles. The interesting thing is, why are we always so scared when any state that is not a great power decides to copy, even just a little bit, the behavior of great powers? All of a sudden, we become scared that they're trying to dominate. But the reality is, they are simply replicating the example that has been, frankly, so successful for great powers in terms of advancing their own interests. So this is expansionist thinking that underscores many of these great powers.
Yeah, and what gets me is that the idea, I think, especially in the United States, this idea that our institutions will hold. It amazes me that after what we went through with President Trump, that people still think that our regular institutions will hold when they clearly didn't. And what I mean by that is, when I read about this, I had tweeted out that I said that I could imagine the U.S. now trying to match what Russia is doing if they do this, and that it's reckless and it's dangerous and it endangers all of humanity. But us, people like us that are trying to prevent nuclear war, we're the idealists. We're the ones that have our heads in the clouds and so on and so forth. And what I got back was a lot of replies again of this outer space treaty, and the US would never violate this and things of that nature. But we have an election coming up, and there's a very likely chance that Donald Trump will be president again.
Yeah.
This is the man that put together Space Force. Not sure what they do, but we have Space Force.
When it comes to defending America, it is not enough to merely have an American presence in space. We must have American dominance in space. So important.
This is a man who recently said that he wanted, like Israel, to have an iron dome, but the way he was describing it, people think he actually thinks it's a literal iron dome that's just going to, actually Truman Show type thing, right? Yes. And here's what really gets me is, and I'm not saying I'm Nostradamus, but just, if you just look at the history of this past administration, a couple days ago, former Vice President Mike Pence was asked about this. And instead of saying unequivocally, no, we would never do this, we will not weaponize space, we will stick to the treaty. Instead, he says that in the interest of every nation, the issue should be decided on the principle that peace comes through strength, and we should continue to look at this. So to me, there you go. The door is not shut. And depending on what happens, we could see the U.S. trying to go tit for tat on this. So This idea that institutions will hold and that cooler heads will prevail and that we're just getting worked up over nothing seems to me that to me seems like the naive way of looking at something like this.
Oh, absolutely. Let's just break down what you said about Mike Pence's statement. Peace comes through strength. I mean, what kind of peace can you achieve through strength? Let's take this to like a high school playground where you have, students on recess and trying to peacefully coexist. Now, only a bully would walk out and say, peace comes through strength. So I'm going to bully everyone to conform to my ideals so that there can be peace. A counter argument to this is peace comes through accommodation. And this is actually the logic that underscores the institutions that we have ordered human activity around. International law, the United Nations, and the different institutions that we have created require that every state be willing to accommodate the interests of other states and not impose their own versions of what peace should look like. So peace through accommodation, right?
So, to recap, we have at various times the US has tried to do this Star Wars space thing. We have Russia threatening now to put nuclear weapons in space. We have treaties that are supposed to stop this, but appear not to be worth anything if nobody adheres to them, and there's no way to enforce them. We have a former administration, former vice president, who's saying, we might want to go tit for tat here. So, with all that said, and everything going on in people's day to day lives, trying to put food on the table and pay student loans, and they're going to school and they're going to their jobs and they're worrying about, everything going on. Should our listeners, how worried should they be about this particular story? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, I'm not worried at all, 10, I'm actually going to start building my bunker tomorrow. Where should they be on this?
Honestly, I would say a 6.
Okay. And if we say if you're at a 6, which isn't something to sneeze at, we certainly don't want to leave our listeners with, you should be on a scale of 1 to 10, 6 scared that Russians are going to put nuclear weapons in space and you're no longer going to have the internet or your GPS or anything else going on. So if somebody now, cares about this issue and what could they actually do? Are there things they could do? Are there steps they could take to either educate themselves or try to stop this from happening? Or is this just out of the ordinary person's hands? Give us, what could they do?
Honestly, to an extent, when we look at issues of great power politics, a lot of the behaviors of great powers is out of the ordinary person's hands in terms of what they choose to do. But the rules they have to adhere to, I think, is a different story. The creation of international law and treaties, in recent times especially, has come from popular grassroots democratic movements calling on states to create and adhere to a rules-based order. And so in this regard, I would say that people have the option and opportunity in their various countries to demand some sort of accountability, to demand that their governments, regardless of which country it is, demand that their governments also demand an explanation of Russia's intentions vis-a-vis the rules that they have to adhere to in the Outer Space Treaty. If you put enough pressure on your representatives to act in a particular way and you make the status quo unbearable for them, they also have to act and demand accountability from other states. So I think in this regard, people can do something. And the final thing I'm going to point out is people need to educate themselves about the world. And this is what we're trying to make easier by explaining on this podcast, right? But I find it so annoying how many people are so comfortable acting like ostriches and putting their head in the sand and thinking, oh, this is some big politics thing and I don't have the time to worry about it. That is precisely why, great power politics operates the way it does because too many people are just disinterested and too trusting of their own governments.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I get it. I get that. Yeah, if you're scrolling on Twitter, you're on TikTok, or whatever social media platform, and the term doom scrolling is a normal thing now, and it's just one bad story after another, one heartache after another, and so now when you talk about nuclear weapons in space, you go, I can't even wrap my head around this. I just need to divorce myself from the whole thing. So I do get it. But yeah, I think you're exactly right that if you feel helpless and you want to do something, that there are little things that you can do on a daily basis. That is, you can be conscious of who you wear, right, and where you shop, and what companies you support, and what you read and who you listen to, and all of those kind of things, to not only educate yourself, but even in those small ways say, I'm not going to support the action of this particular government or this particular leader. And again, you may think, well, I'm not doing much by myself, but collectively, when it's being done all over the world, then change can happen. So I think what we'll do is we'll leave it there. And our hope is that we did take this issue and broke it down for you and made it again easily digestible so that you could understand it a little bit better. We're certainly going to keep you informed if there's any new developments about this situation. And I encourage you to keep a lookout for our next regular episode of Minds Blown, where we are going to preview the Oscar films that explore nuclear disarmament. And no, we are not just talking about Oppenheimer. So we're going to look at the history of this issue in film and TV. So as always, we want to thank Lex International, Jason, and the whole team for helping us put this together. You can follow us at minds_blown pod on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow us on our website at mindsblown.show. And if you like this podcast, you can give us a follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you again for listening and giving us a chance here. And we will be talking to you soon. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
See you next time. Mind Blown is produced by Jackson Street Collective and made possible by Lex International.
All right, and now we're recording.
I have some Bombay Sapphire.
Nice.
Because I've noticed that just pure alcohol, when I sip it very little, it makes my mouth enunciate better. Just because it's on fire.
If that's what you want to keep telling yourself, sure. But
for real. I used to always shoot alcohol before a news interview, but then I discovered shooting it doesn't work because halfway through the interview I get a little bit lazy and relaxed. If I just micro sip, I still have the same effect without actually getting even tipsy at all.